You spoke this week, interpreting what you said as we dissect the results of election 2014 in our bi-state area. Also this half hour, gay marriage stealing the headlines on both sides of state line. Plus, will there be anyone left? Huge job slashings at Sprint. And the final nail in the coffin for Kemper Arena. Welcome everyone, I'm Nick Haynes. After countless millions spent, dinners interrupted by robocalls, and every TV break filled with attack ads for the better part of a month, it's finally over. So how do you explain what happened and what happens now? Fresh from the campaign trail is 41 Action News political reporter Garrett Haake. From Topeka, Jim McLean with the KHI News Service, formerly Kansas State House bureau chief for the Topeka Capital Journal. Kansas City Star editorial board writer and columnist Barbara Shelley, and the executive editor of Ingram's Magazine, Jack Cashel. Now, for the better part of September, polls had shown independent candidate Greg Orman with a lead of as much as 10 points over incumbent Kansas U.S. Senator Pat Roberts. There were concerns that at 78, Roberts was simply too old and had become too disconnected from the state he served. There were even ads claiming he merely rented a lazy boy at a donor's house. But none of that seemed to matter Tuesday as Roberts coasted to victory with a remarkably comfortable 11-point win over his opponent.
Tonight, Kansas stood up and said, enough. Enough of the gridlock, enough of the failed leadership under President Obama and, yes, Harry Reid, and enough of the unconstitutional maneuvers of an intrusive federal government.
Garrett Haake, what did Orman do so wrong, or what did Pat Roberts do so right?
I don't think Orman did much wrong. I think he played the cards he was dealt. But Pat Roberts did two smart things, and then he got lucky. Basically, they decided to nationalize this race early on when it became clear that it was going to be a two-man race. This was not going to be a race against Greg Orman. It was going to be a race against Barack Obama. And that proved to be the smartest tactical decision they could possibly make. When you look at the results nationwide, this entire midterm election appears to have been a Republican wave, reputing some Democratic control of both the Senate and the White House. And Pat Roberts was able to ride that all the way to the finish line.
Jim.
Yes. Well, I agree. I think there was a great story that you shared with us in our briefing materials where Roberts is somewhere midpoint of the campaign. He's getting ready for the debate in Hutchinson at the Farm Bureau debate at the State Fair. And he's got this thick briefing book, and somebody hands him a single sheet of paper and says, you know, really, this is the theme. Just campaign against the president and campaign, you know, this is how we're going to win this race. And he balked at that at first, had to be talked into it, but I would agree that's what made the difference in the race. That and the fact that Orman did not have a party apparatus behind him. And at the very end of the day, when it's time to get out the vote, if you don't have that machinery behind you, it's very difficult to win.
And it's not just that, Jack Cashel, because when you look at the exit polling, it showed only tepid support for Orman, even among independent voters. Among the 28% of Kansas voters who reported they were independent, only a slim majority cast their ballots for Orman. By contrast, nearly 90% of Republicans voted for Roberts. How come?
Well, Greg Orman never had a chance. I mean, the whole thing was an illusion from the beginning. And especially since he's running as a new kind of candidate. No, he was an old kind of candidate. He wasn't telling anyone what he stood for. And by not telling them, it allowed Roberts to tell people what he did stand for, who he donated to in the past. You donate to Barack Obama, you donate to Harry Reid. You are not going to win in the state of Kansas against a guy who's, although not well loved, votes consistently conservatively and reflects the will of most of the voters.
Barbara.
Well, I'm not sure I would agree that Greg Orman did not tell people what he stood for. On issues, he was pretty clear. You know, he was pretty clear on what he'd do about immigration. That is a nuanced issue, and yeah, he believed in, you know, not shipping everybody back across the border, and you know, he did speak to issues. But as far as who he's, you know, going to caucus with, yeah, I'm not sure there's any percentage in him revealing that. It would have taken away whatever negotiating power he had if he had gotten to Congress. But, you know, I also agree that the Republican brand is really strong in Kansas. And, yeah, once Robert got going on that theme.
Is there anything that Orman could have done differently that would have changed the result on Election Day?
On Election Day, probably not. By then, I think his goose was already cooked by Election Day. The get out the vote apparatus is probably working. worth 1 or 2 points if he had a stronger infrastructure. They made a sort of a strategic bet early on that people would be willing to vote against Washington gridlock as a concept, that they'd be willing to buy into sort of his views on campaign finance and some of this big picture stuff that people in these kinds of circles like to talk about, but are not typically the things that really truly motivate voters to go to the polls.
Could he have done anything differently, Jack?
No, I mean, I thought he ran a good campaign, given who he was and where he was coming from. That much said, you know, I mean, for instance, the Kansans for Life sent out 600,000 pieces of literature. I've talked to a lot of those people. They knew where Greg Orman stood on that issue, and they weren't going to vote for him. They weren't, you know, he wouldn't say where he was going to vote on Obamacare. He wasn't going to say what he was going to vote on the pipeline. I mean, why would why would a Republican?
He addressed Obamacare. He was not in favor of repeal of Obamacare.
Okay,
he talked about
exactly.
that,
So
and he talked about ways to fix it.
And a state that's 60% Republican,
Right,
in a state that's 60% Republican, why would a Republican vote for him?
Listen, in our system, independents just don't do well, and there are slivers of time in our political history where you can even mount a campaign like that, and this was one of them. And he thought that he was going to, people were going to send him to.
And the polls showed it.
Yes,
almost all the way through September, he was up to.
But in
10
the end,
points
didn't you hear Roberts at the end in his victory speech say, Kansas has spoken, and we're going to end gridlock by re-electing me and putting the Republicans in charge. So that was Orman's theme from start to finish. And
Pat Roberts co-opted
co-opted
the change message. It was really interesting to see both of these guys trying to run as the change candidate. I mean, the irony of a guy who's been a senator for 3 terms running as the change candidate is flabbergasting, but it's incredibly effective if you can nationalize the race and really sell that. And the Roberts people ran a 50+1 campaign. They were going to get the one extra vote they needed to hammer this home, and they succeeded.
What role did this man play in Pat Roberts' victory? K-State football coach Bill Snyder, whose last-minute commercials touched off controversy, Jim McLean.
Well, I'm not sure he played any role at all in the victory, because, I mean, at the end it was a muddled message. Was he? Yes, he was for him. He's a good friend, but he got duped into making the commercial. So in the end, I think it was more of a
I was at the gym, and I heard 2 young people say, "Hey, did you hear who coach is supporting the old guy? Oh, let's vote for him." I heard 2 people say this.
The role he played was the misreporting on Bill Snyder's support and endorsement of Pat Roberts from the beginning, which then the media tried to turn it into, oh no, he wasn't supporting him.
Well, and this is one of those things that campaigns can do with 3 or 4 days left. You can be way out there, and whether or not we may never get to the bottom of what Bill Snyder knew he was doing or not, but to the Roberts campaign, it doesn't matter. All right. They got the job done.
Conservative governance, we were told, faced a clear referendum in the re-election bid of Kansas Governor Sam Brownback.
I feel like the end of a 15th round of a Rocky match.
Paul Davis argued on the campaign trail that Brownback had the wrong priorities for Kansas. Did voters want a governor who slashed taxes and changed the way judges were picked? Well, on Tuesday, 4% more Kansans bought into Brownback's vision than the one presented by Davis. A Kansas political scientist quoted in the Star right after the election was emphatic. Davis simply didn't do enough to build his own image and relied too much on criticizing the governor and his policies. Is that why Paul Davis is not measuring the drapes in the governor's mansion this week, Barbara Shelley?
Oh, yeah, I'm aware that Chapman Rockaway from Fort Hays State has been saying that all along. But, you know, to be honest, Nick, it's very hard to be Paul Davis running in Kansas. Because A, you're a Democrat. B, his main issue was the Brownback tax cuts, which have decimated the budget there. But unless you're Sam Brownback and can say, give it time, my tax cuts are going to work and everything's going to be great, you're in a box because you have to say, you know, you're going to raise taxes, which you don't want to do. And if there's no revenue and you're not going to raise taxes, there's not a lot you can do to govern the state of Kansas at the moment.
So why did Sam Brownback win, Jack Cashel?
Because he's a Republican running in a Republican state in a Republican year. And you know, and people are aware. I mean, the people were paying attention, despite the relentless media assault against Brownback's tax cut for the last 2 years. The tax cut went into effect in 2013. We're saying of Obama, give it some chance, give his economic plan some chance. 6 years in 2013, we're saying it's the sky is falling. And we know. Here's what we do know: is from 2000 to 2012. Kansas had a net loss in private sector jobs. Something had to be done. There were too many people to play, who refused to yield to So the scare message is coming out, and it made the difference.
Jim.
Well, I don't think the results of the governor's race, yes, Brownback won, but I don't think the results of the governor's race suggest that Kansas voters feel confident in the governor's tax policy. In fact, the exit polls show exactly the opposite. A majority of Kansas voters are concerned about them and voted for Brownback, notwithstanding that concern, for a lot of reasons that are being dissected in terms of the strength of the Davis campaign and was the Democratic Party and the underperformance in Wyandotte County, and on and on and on. But this is not an endorsement of the Brownback tax policies, and the sky is not falling, but Kansas revenues are. And that's just a fact. It's not a relentless attack by the media. It's a fact. And we're going to see when the consensus estimators get together on Monday what the revenue picture really looks like. He won re-election. But Sam Brownback and the legislature in Kansas have real work to do and tough decisions to make. And there are a lot of people who think that that's the whole point here, that they wanted to engineer a situation where policymakers would eventually start making these tough spending decisions that they've been unwilling to make.
Jim McLean then mentions these exit polls, which were done in the race by the national network television stations. And there were some intriguing take-homes, at least for me. Here's some of those quick factoids of the more than 2,000 people asked leaving polling stations. Do you think the governor's tax cuts helped or hurt the Kansas economy? 53% said they hurt Kansas more than they helped. But interestingly, 11% of those who said they voted for Sam Brownback also said they believed the tax cuts hurt Kansas. So they had other reasons to still support him. Another interesting exit poll observation, 1 in 4 voters who supported Paul Davis identified themselves as being evangelical or born-again Christians. When asked which issue was the most important facing the country, Brownback supporters listed not the economy or Obamacare, but illegal immigration is the #1 issue. And when all voters were asked, should the state legalize gay marriage, 51% said no. So do we learn anything from this, or is exit polling totally arbitrary, Garrett Haake?
Well, exit polling, it's always tough to read too much into it, but I do think I see 2 interesting messages in there. #1, the irrelevance of social issues largely in this campaign, that the evangelical Christians were coming to Paul Davis's side, that despite the gay marriage, same-sex marriage being such an issue of discussion in Kansas over the last couple of weeks, that didn't seem to sway things one way or the other. The other thing is, I think underscores Jack's point about being a Republican in a Republican state in a Republican year. Illegal immigration is not a Kansas issue. It's just not a really relevant factor in the economy of Kansas. If that's what people are coming out and voting on, you're talking about a big national picture. And that means this race, maybe Roberts, maybe just in general, was nationalized to the point that people were coming out and voting for an R, not necessarily for Sam Brownback.
But illegal immigration isn't a big issue because, remember, another high-profile Kansas Republican celebrating Tuesday night, Chris Kobach, the Kansas Secretary of State.
I think my race was a referendum on photo ID and proof of citizenship.
Kobach's campaign against Democrat Gene Shodorf was also attracting national attention thanks to the immigration issues brought up in the race. Kobach successfully pushed the Kansas legislature to pass the nation's first proof of citizenship requirement for new voters, with Kobach winning this race by a comfortable 58 to 42%. Is there a take-home here about how we are sizing up the immigration issue in Kansas, Barbara?
I am honestly not sure how to explain that margin of victory for Chris Kobach. But, I will say, yeah, Garrett's right. Immigration is a federal issue, and yet it seems to matter to a lot of Kansans, and it's possibly because politicians whip up this issue. Now, if people are really concerned about the economy of Kansas, they would actually want more immigration out in western Kansas to keep the economy fueled up.
Right, and I should clarify. I mean, Kansas, Kansas' only borders are with, Missouri and Oklahoma. I mean, it's not an issue that the state of Kansas can proactively address. So I'm not to say that it's not an issue on the minds of Kansas voters, but I find that result interesting too. I think maybe this is in part because of the lack of oxygen that ultimately that race got locally because of the Davis-Brownback, Orman-Roberts races, that race didn't really get fleshed out. I'd be curious to see how much people know about Kobach, his policies in general, beyond sort of the circles that discuss this kind of thing regularly.
Kobach's the most popular politician in the state of Kansas. Among Republicans, he is hugely more popular than Roberts or Brownback or anyone else. He's a rock star in the state of Kansas, in the Republican side. You underestimate him at your own peril. And also, I would just say to the point of the social issues, they weren't debated surfacely, but like I say, the Kansas for Life sent out 6,000 mailers, made 600,000 phone calls. I've been surveying my Kansas friends. Why'd you vote for Brownback? Abortion. For 8 years, Kansas was the late-term abortion capital of the world. up until and during the Sebelius administration. They remember that. That's not an insignificant issue, even though it wasn't debated.
Yeah, Kobach is a rising star. He's charismatic, he's smart, and again, the issue of illegal immigration, the extent to which we have voter fraud in Kansas, really isn't the point. I think the whole issue of illegals immigration is a proxy issue. Barbara, you pointed it out. Politicians can whip people up with that issue because people are unsettled about a lot of things: the economy, their future, their jobs, the future of small towns, and they feel a threat coming. They don't know exactly where to place the blame, and so that issue is kind of a proxy issue for just the insecurity that I think that people feel generally, largely because of the economy. I don't think it's necessarily about the nuts and bolts of the issue itself.
Well, Republicans were elected to every statewide office in Kansas and every congressional seat. In Jefferson City, the GOP strengthened their grip on the Missouri legislature, expanding their veto-proof supermajorities to historic levels as they picked up seats in both the House and the Senate. In both chambers, Republicans no longer will need help from wayward Democrats to override a veto from Governor Nixon. Meanwhile, the GOP tide also washed down to the Kansas legislature, where in the Kansas House, Republicans now control their largest number of seats since 1952. Can you point to any place in our bi-state region where a Democrat did well or better than expected? Crickets?
No.
Okay.
Sly James successfully got the Clay Chastain ballot measures defeated. I suppose
that's a stretch. All right.
I suppose that's a positive news.
He
for
wasn't
one
on the
Democrat
ballot,
in our
though.
area.
Okay.
This wasn't, well, yeah, there was the judge in Cole County, where Jefferson City is, who survived her re-election, right? Despite
really stretching here,
everyone.
Really stretching.
Right,
No, clearly. One thing that was interesting in one of the stories that I read was several of the Democrats in the Kansas House who lost by very narrow margins. Yeah. Mangini down in Crawford County, Trimmer, and I mean the point is the Democrats are saying to the extent that the voter issue mattered in terms of several thousand voters being disqualified and not able to vote for various reasons, it may have shown up in some of these races where there really were close margins where incumbent Democrats were defeated. But generally speaking, no, the Democrats were soundly beaten.
Jack, did you see any evidence?
Yeah, I thought that Davis did pretty well. I mean, he got 46% of the vote. Yeah. I mean, that's better than. And Brownback got 63% 4 years ago.
That's a good point.
But that and $2 will get you a cup of coffee. I mean, it doesn't do it in any closer to the governor's
You're looking for silver linings, I'll throw it at you.
Well, voters were deciding a slew of ballot questions on Election Day. In Missouri, voters by a wide margin said yes to an amendment that will now allow prior criminal acts to be used in the prosecution of suspected child sex offenders. A huge number of voters rejected a teacher tenure amendment in Missouri, and 3 out of 4 voters killed plans for early voting in the Show Me State. They did approve Amendment 10, limiting the governor's budget powers. In Kansas City, voters rejected questions 1 and 2 that would have funded Clay Chastain's light rail plan. And the one you've been waiting for, yes, Kansans by huge amounts did decriminalize charitable raffles, which up until this point have been totally illegal in the state. But a round of quick-fire questions complete this sentence. The biggest winner of election 2014 in our bi-state area was blank, Jack Cashel.
Well, this will be, I mean, it's a surprise answer. I would say and this surprised me, I'm a Missouri resident, the rejection of that early voting, which says to me, people know why they want early voting, and that is, for some people, it allows, I hate to say this, it allows for more vote harvesting, that is just sending people to the polls in buses, and more vote fraud. And that's why it was rejected.
The biggest winner for you in our bi-state region was blank.
Maybe supply-side economics and Brownback's opportunity to put it in place for another 4 years.
Jim McLean.
Well, I think Kansas Republicans and the governor's economic plan, however, I think that the biggest, but things can change very quickly. And a year or 2 from now, I think we ought to re-examine that question.
Garrett.
I'm going to give the win to Sam Brownback. When you look at all the things that were lined up against him, from the newspaper endorsements to the strong opposition for the first time, to sort of this feeling that he was going to maybe get through this by the skin of his teeth, to ride that Republican wave back in, I think he had the best night.
Well, fill in this blank then, Jim McLean. The biggest loser of election 2014 in our bi-state area was blank.
Well, the obvious answer is Kansas Democrats from my side of the line, but they had an awful lot potentially to gain if they. And I agree with Jack. Frankly, I think Paul Davis ran a very respectable campaign, and had the election been held 2 or 3 weeks ago, we might have seen a close race, if not a different result. But clearly, it's now a party, a lot of finger pointing going on internally, a lot of disarray. They don't know where to go next, and I think they're clearly the biggest loser and kind of in the wilderness, so to speak, at the moment.
And to that, I would add Kansas moderate Republicans. Yes. They are in the wilderness with the Democrats.
How many of them are there, really?
Yeah, and they are truly decimated now and discouraged. Yeah.
Yes. Jack Cashill, biggest loser for you in election 2014?
The media in Kansas and Kansas City, who for the last several years did everything in their power to drive Chris Kobach and Sam Brownback out of office, and they failed.
Garrett Haake.
I'll leave that alone. My biggest loser is probably Jay Nixon, who's going to be a very lonely man in Jefferson City for the next 2 years, trying to get anything done or to sustain vetoes or to hold back a Republican supermajority that now feels very emboldened.
Hey, I just want to just say, as far as Jack's comment there, we, the media, we're watching the Kansas budget, and we have a responsibility to talk about a budget that is currently spending more than it's taking in and has, at the moment, no point of changing that in a state that must turn in a balanced budget.
Right, but on the national level, you care about that? I mean, seriously.
Yes, we do care about it.
Well, I think Barbara's point is really interesting, though, about the moderate Republicans. The other night, I mean, there was a great deal of optimism that they were creating this purple coalition in Kansas, and that was going to govern in a bipartisan way, and they had these idealistic thoughts, and really, and it was dashed in a moment, but it was a really interesting coalition. I'd never seen anything like that in Kansas politics. Now, that moderate Republican force may be a mile wide and an inch deep. Maybe that's what the election showed. But when I was at the Davis watch party covering it the other night, I saw Wendell Lady, Dick Bond, people who I had known for years on the Republican side of the ledger in the legislature showing up and at the Davis party. And that was very different. Now, it didn't seem to make the difference they thought it was going to make, particularly in Johnson County. When Davis didn't carry Johnson County, it was all over for him, given all that moderate Republican support.
Okay, some quick hits on some other headlines making the news that are actually connected to the election, as exit polling in Kansas on Election Day showed that 51% of Kansans want to maintain the state's ban on gay marriage. A federal judge in Kansas City chose Election Day to rule that same-sex couples can wed in Kansas and that the state's ban is unconstitutional. Now, same-sex couples can't get their licenses just yet. Judge Daniel Crabtree said his injunction won't take effect until 5 p.m. on Tuesday. Kansas Attorney General Derek Schmidt, who was re-elected this week, says the state will appeal. Meanwhile, less than 24 hours after the Kansas decision, a state judge in Missouri overturns the Show Me State's constitutional ban on gay marriage in a ruling that immediately set off a rush among some same-sex couples to apply for marriage licenses there. Missouri Attorney General Chris Costa immediately appealed the ruling to the state Supreme Court, saying the constitutional challenge must be presented to and resolved at that level. But is there a disconnect between the decision made at the ballot box this week in our bi-state area and these two legal rulings? Jack?
Of course there is. And I am surprised how giddy people get about celebrating a one-person decision to overturn constitutional amendments passed in either state. And we know, by the way, yesterday another judge upheld the ban in 4 states. So this will end up in the Supreme Court. Forget how you feel about gay marriage. How do you feel about the Constitution? How do you feel about the rule of law? How do you feel about the will of the people? Shouldn't this matter?
Those are very separate things. The will of the people in this case, you're right. I mean, you look at the exit polls, it's about 51-40 something in opposing same-sex marriage. But these judges are looking at the Constitution, which makes the United States of America.
And it talks about gay marriage where?
It talks about equal protection under the law. And if the state doesn't have an overwhelming reason to, make these decisions, they can't do it. And now you've had just this morning another judge here in Jackson County in the Missouri side also saying that the state's prohibition against same-sex marriage is unconstitutional at the federal level. Okay. The view of the people is one thing and not to be discounted, but there is a constitution, a federal constitution that has its own
that is
rules.
Totally silent on the subject of gay marriage, period.
You know, when Kansas had its gay marriage amendment on the ballot, which I think was 2006, that thing passed probably by 70 or 75%, and now the polling is showing it's down to 51%. So, you know, maybe these federal court rulings are running a little ahead of public sentiment, but there's going to be a time when gay marriage is legal in Kansas
but it
and
does seem
Missouri, and
to
no one's
be
going
at
to care.
odds, though, with how this election went, and now we see these rulings. It just is an interesting.
Well, maybe or maybe not. I think Barbara makes a good point. I think the gap between the vote that the amendment got when it was passed versus the 51%.
Okay.
I think that tells us a lot. But also, I think this notion, people make emotional decisions at the ballot box. We've been talking about that all the time. The judiciary is supposed to make decisions based on the rule of law, on the record, you know, and very technical decisions. And the extent that we want to politicize that, I think we will rue the day that we make that a political issue.
All right. Does Sprint have that many employees left to lose? Overland Park-based Sprint, now owned by Japanese cell phone company SoftBank, is heading for 3,700 job cuts. It's part of an aggressive campaign to reduce budgets and overall spending by $1.5 billion under new CEO Marcelo Claure. It means that in the last 2 years, 1 in 4 Sprint jobs will have disappeared. This is a Kansas-side company. This can't make Sam Brownback too happy when he's trying to show he's adding new jobs to the economy. This is going to be a big net loss he's going to have to make up, Jim.
Yes, he's going to have to. It's just business. I mean, we talked about a nationalized election. Well, it's an international business decision. Right. I mean, it's not a Kansas City business. It's not a parochial issue. These business forces that are at work, particularly with these big cellular networks, are well beyond the ability of any region, any city, anybody, any incentive you could throw their way. They're making these decisions for lots of reasons.
Jack.
You know, we just had at Ingram's a roundtable of local bankers, and here's what they said, and this was irrelevant. I'm not specifically to Sprint, but said Kansas City loses businesses because national companies come in and buy them out or assume them. They gain businesses by growing new businesses. The whole purpose of the tax cuts in Kansas is to create a ground where you can grow new business. Mm-hmm. And so the Sprint, I mean, you might want to try to blame it on whomever. That's not the point.
No.
And the way you do it is you got to grow them here because the big national companies are going to come and buy them out.
Yeah, okay. You can't change the international marketplace for, you know, cell phone.
All right, that's all we have time for. I'd love to be able to do the Kemper story, which I promise we'll do it next week because we've got into gay marriage and elections, and I didn't want to shortchange that conversation. Our thanks to Barbara Shelley and Garrett Hake, joining us from Topeka, Jim McLean, and Jack Cashel from Ingram's Magazine. I'm Nick Haynes. From all of us, breathlessly here at KCPT, thanks for spending part of your weekend with us.